I'm Nasser Danishveri, and I would like to welcome all of you this evening with our featured speaker, Alan Mallach. Alan Mallach is a non-resident senior fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is also a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. A city planner, writer, and consultant on housing, land use, and urban affairs, Alan has been engaged as practitioner, advocate, and a scholar in the fields of housing and planning and community development for more than 40 years. During that period, he has made significant contributions in many areas, including development of the affordable and mixed income housing, community development, neighborhood revival, and community schools. In recent years, he has devoted his attention to developing strategies for the revival of distressed older cities and inner city neighborhoods, with particular attention on the issues of equity and social inclusion. Most recently, Alan devoted his attention on the neighborhood and property impacts of the growing foreclosure crisis. I have an announcement here also. I think Bill announced about the next Wednesday, November 10th, that the new guest speaker would be here. And I hope you all plan to join our next Wednesday's lecture. But without any further ado, may I call Alan Mallach to the stage so he can speak on the issue of the housing market reset and future of American housing policy.
Thank you, Nasser. It works. So, good afternoon, good evening, and I'm delighted to be in Las Vegas. I should mention, this is really, it's the second time I've been here. It's the first time I have really gotten to see beyond the Strip. So I've just been intrigued by it. I think I knew very little about Las Vegas before this Sunday afternoon, but I can say that now, having been here for slightly more than 2 days, I'm an expert. However, I'm not going to be talking about Las Vegas and the Valley today, basically. I'm going to be talking about national issues, though I'll try to illustrate them with examples from the Valley from time to time. And I'm going to try to cover 3 major subjects. First, I'm going to touch very briefly on what brought us to this point. Second, to offer some thoughts about where we're going and what is likely to happen with respect to the economy and the housing market in particular over the next 10 years. And I'm picking 10 years because since prophecy is an inexact science at best, 10 years is about as far as you want to push it without looking utterly ridiculous. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what I see as the implications of all of this for American housing policy, both in general and in terms of affordable housing in particular. And even though I'm not going to offer a lot of good news, I do think what is really important is that we do in fact start taking a serious look at housing policy in this country, which we really haven't for a long time, and perhaps use the crisis that we're in as an opportunity for seriously rethinking our housing policies. So, basically, from the late 1990s to the middle of the past decade, this country went on a binge. There's no other word for it. We created an unprecedented housing bubble. While it affected the entire country, it did so unevenly. And it was characterized by 3 major factors. First, the growth of the subprime industry and the all but total elimination of underwriting as a relevant factor in lending. And this is the explosion of subprime lending. Second, massive overbuilding of housing. And this I find absolutely amazing. I would not have expected it to be this drastic. But so as you can see, this graph compares the new housing units that were authorized with the actual change from year to year in the number of occupied housing units. Now, in theory, if you look at a 10-year period, the number of new units authorized ought to bear a pretty close relationship to the number of actual houses, additional houses that were occupied. I mean, isn't that what it's supposed to be about? You build houses for people to live in them? Well, the gap between, over 10 years, this country authorized 7 million more housing units than during the same period were occupied. I mean, that is, again, it's an indication of the extent to which we were in a bubble economy. The other thing, of course, is we had incredible price increases. And again, you see Las Vegas was kind of remarkable in that it just literally almost overnight, around 2003, prices took off in this area to an extent that nobody could have believed. And, of course, what is equally remarkable and frightening, in fact, was the extent to which, almost instantaneously with prices taking off, the most incredible speculative frenzy took over the entire regional housing market and continued until the whole thing collapsed. Of course, we know house prices collapsed, foreclosures took off, and construction ended, all but ended. And so within 4 years, building permits in this metro area went from an average of about 13,000, 14,000 a year to less than 2,000 a year. And this crash was most pronounced in the Sun Belt, Arizona, California, Florida, and Nevada, which saw the greatest amount of overbuilding and price increases, and in the Rust Belt, the older industrial states of Michigan, Ohio in particular, where the effects of this crash really compounded an already weak economic conditions. But virtually every part of the United States was affected. So now we are 4 years into this, and I find it kind of amazing because thinking back in 2006, early 2007, when the fact that the bubble was bursting first became apparent, I don't think many people, if you'd asked people, did they believe that 4 years later we'd still be waiting for the bottom? I don't think most people would have expected that. We don't have crises that go on this long in this country. And frankly, I think part of the problem is we're not very good at dealing with this kind of crisis. So one byproduct is that the homeownership rate has declined drastically. And in fact, in the last 4 years, there are 3 million more renters than there were in 2006. And fewer, even though the population has increased by over 3 million households, we actually have fewer total homeowners than we did 4 years ago. Foreclosure rates are still incredibly high. And as this shows, what's happening is even though the actual number of filings has not changed drastically, the actual number of REOs, while it's gone up somewhat, has also not changed drastically. In the last 2 years, the number of foreclosures in the pipeline waiting to happen and the number of houses in default where foreclosures have not even been filed on those houses has increased exponentially. So the entire foreclosure process has started to look like the classic model of the pig stuck in a python's stomach, with millions of houses in a kind of limbo between default, foreclosure, and ultimate REO. And this is going to haunt us, even if, as some people believe is the case, the actual movement of additional houses into default is slowing down. This overhang will haunt us for years to come. The other thing that's going to haunt us for years to come is the number of underwater houses. In Las Vegas, actually in the state of Nevada, 2/3 of all of the mortgages in the state are underwater, roughly 25% nationally. This is a huge drag on the market. Another thing that's quite amazing, as you can see, is we now have the highest housing vacancy rates that we have had since the Census Bureau started keeping track of that sort of thing in the 1960s. So these vacancy rates in most parts of the country are way above what economists and real estate people consider healthy for a housing market. And then, finally, housing for the most part in the United States has become very affordable. Prices have come down. And the interesting thing about this is, as you can see, this is true of almost every part of the United States. But you can see the outliers, and you have California, Hawaii, Seattle. I don't think this goes that far. Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., and the only outlier that's not on an ocean, Boulder, Colorado. And these are the only parts of the United States where one can actually make an argument that housing is not generally affordable to the great majority of the population. And I'll come back to that, but it's significant, and I would say that what's notable about all of these areas is they all tend to have quite sophisticated and diverse economies, and they also have very serious constraints on adding housing supply, which has tended to keep prices up. So the upshot of all of this was a massive recession, and even though, as we all know, the recession was officially declared over in 2009, basically, I think most of us don't really believe it. I mean, maybe there's a group of economists somewhere who have calculated that it is so. But if we look at the housing market, if we look at unemployment, look at those things, it doesn't feel like the recession is over. And I think this is showing itself at the moment, not just economically, but also socially and politically. So, turning to the larger picture, the first issue is, what are the factors in the economy that are likely to be driving what happens in the next 5 or 10 years? Okay. First thing, this is a pretty grim little table. What it shows that when you calculate you look at real weekly earnings for non-supervisory personnel in the United States, they've basically wobbled but gone down since the 1970s. And this, again, goes back to our binge was fueled by borrowing, not by productivity, not by earning, not by substantive economic growth, by debt. Secondly, unemployment rates are far too high for a healthy economy. The expanded unemployment rate is when you add in what are known the discouraged workers who've basically dropped off the map, stopped looking, and people working part-time who want full-time employment. I should mention, as you probably know, that in the Valley, the rate is more than 50% higher than the national rate. The official unemployment rate is 15.3%, which is about the highest rate of any metropolitan area in the United States. Third, consumer confidence is at all-time lows. People, again, don't believe the recession is over. People don't believe that there's any certainty or even likelihood that their lives are going to get better. All of this affects housing. On top of it, this may not be directly relevant for the Valley, but we've seen in the last 5 years, last 10 years really, we've seen a drastic erosion of manufacturing employment and manufacturing activity in this country, which I think, again, is going to be a major drag in the future. And I think, so we're looking at a whole series of factors that work against a strong economic recovery. And I think perhaps the most distressing one, which unfortunately does not lend itself to being put on a graph, is the seeming inability of our political system to adopt constructive approaches to these issues. And if there's one reason, one overriding reason why I believe that despite the fact that this is a rich country with resources, with skilled people, with strong institutions, that I believe that we may not be able to rebuild our economy in a sustained fashion, is because the stasis in our political system has rendered us almost incapable of responding constructively to this crisis. And that is, I think, a very distressing thought. So, if we look at the housing market, I think the most important point that I'll start out with is that I do not believe that what we've been seeing for the last 4 years is a short-term dip in the market, but that it's a fundamental reset, as I call it, of market conditions for at least the medium-term future. A number of forces are driving that. The first is that sluggish economic growth will continue to discourage higher, greater housing consumption. When unemployment remains high, wages stagnant, and consumer confidence low, it's just unrealistic to expect households to extend themselves in terms of housing. They will be more conservative, more likely to rent, and when they do buy, will be more likely to buy at the low end of what they can afford rather than becoming house poor. Secondly, household formation, I believe, is going to slow down significantly from the period of recent history. This is another amazing slide. Between 2000 and 2005, the number of households in the United States grew by 1.1 million a year. Between 2005 and 2009, it grew by 600,000 a year, barely half as much. Now, that was depressed by a lot of factors. But as we go forward, I don't think we are going to see household formation in the next decade at rates that are significantly higher than 800,000 to 900,000 a year. And I think it's interesting, the Joint Center at Harvard just published a very interesting publication on household formation where they estimate, their low estimate is 1 million a year. I think they're optimistic. Third, in terms of the households that are going to be formed, they're going to be low housing demand households. They're going to be single people, senior citizens, and immigrants who tend to at least be initially in low-wage employment. In addition, you layer onto depressed household formation, depressed demand, the fact that we all have such a huge oversupply of housing that has to be absorbed before any significant new development is likely to take place at high levels, is that the upshot is that first, home buying will stay at relatively low levels. And in fact, I think one of the big issues is what's going to happen to the baby boomers as they reach retirement age. And I could see a couple of different scenarios. One is if many of them try to leave their homes, that could, if anything, increase the oversupply, or they could stay in their homes, which would reduce demand. Demand will be low, expectations of appreciation low. People will be buying housing much more for shelter than because they expect to get rich at it. And so housing is unlikely to appreciate in most parts of the country at more than 1% to 2% above the rate of inflation going for the next decade. There will be exceptions. There'll be coastal exceptions. There'll be areas which have, again, sophisticated, diverse economies. And, of course, constraints on development. And then, finally, there will be very low levels of new housing construction. I think whether it's in the Valley or in most other housing markets, construction employment is not going to grow significantly above today's level. And I think that's a huge economic drag for the Valley in particular because, again, 4 or 5 years ago, 12% of the workforce in this area were in construction compared to a national average of about 5%. Since then, it's gone down to about 6%. But those 6% of the workforce jobs are not likely to come back. The hospitality jobs that have been lost may well come back. The construction jobs will probably not come back, and that will mean either that you will continue to have elevated unemployment, which is not good, or there will be continued outmigration, which is also not good. So either way, that represents a significant constraint on revival in this area. Now, I could be wrong about all of this. I want to say this is my best take based on what I think are the most salient facts and the most logical probabilities. But prophesying is tricky stuff, and I could be wrong. But this is how I see it. Now I'd like to turn to the second part of what I'm going to talk about, which is how this will or should alter housing policy. And in the hopes that through this and through other efforts, we will start talking about housing policy again. Because I think it's amazing. Housing represents probably 30% of the average family's expenditures, 30% of our national domestic spending, 40 or 50% of our total household wealth. And yet, I don't know that there has been a serious discussion about American housing policy at any serious level for decades. And it's long overdue. And one evidence of that is that now that the mortgage system has collapsed, and Fannie and Freddie are in federal receivership, and there is all but no private mortgage industry left, the entire country is in a state of befuddlement about what to do about it. And frankly, I must admit, I don't have the answer either. But it just, again, reflects the extent to which we have not been considering issues. So think about, there are just so many basic issues that we aren't thinking about. And I'll just throw out, before coming up with my suggestions, I'll throw out a bunch of them. Is housing an investment or is it a shelter? Or is it shelter? And should public policy encourage one or the other? Can it encourage both? Okay. To what extent should we be encouraging home ownership? And in particular, to what extent should we encourage home ownership about people, whether they be ethnic minorities or lower income people who've traditionally had lower home ownership rates than the rest of the population? Should we encourage people to maximize consumption of housing or reduce their consumption of housing to make more resources available elsewhere? Should we encourage people to maximize their debt and the amount they borrow, or should we encourage people to save and use their equity to become homeowners? Is there a tension between promoting new construction and maintaining existing housing? And when we adopt policies to encourage home building, are we directing resources away from the maintenance of the existing housing stock? Should we take steps to encourage a multifamily rental construction industry or encourage conversion of housing to rental use? Should we encourage the residents of urban and inner suburban areas to vote with their feet by moving to the suburban fringe? Or should we try to keep people in urban areas? How do we link housing policy to energy, water use, transportation? And then, what should our affordable housing policy that's specifically directed to lower income people look like? And should it be a model, and I would say this is our basic model, that is really a kind of lottery which picks out a small percentage of those eligible or in need for very generous assistance while providing nothing at all to the overwhelming majority of lower income people. So I think these are just some questions, and I would suggest pick one or two of them and think about them at leisure. I think they're worth giving a lot of thought. So in turning to specific policies, I think the first thing and again, I realize that I'm in a state with strong libertarian tendencies, but public policy, whether you like it or not, has enormous power to influence housing. I mean, one's house may be one's castle, but that castle is not the product of an untrammeled free market. That castle is the product of the intersection of development regulations and tax policies. And the mortgage you have on your castle is a product of a series of fiscal and regulatory policies, right or for wrong. So we tend to take this for granted and not really think about the extent to which housing decisions, housing actions, investments, and so forth are powerfully influenced, for good or for bad, by government policy, which means both action and inaction. Government inaction on regulating certain types of mortgage activities during the last decade was as much a factor as inappropriate or untimely government action. So as we move forward, though, into what I expect to be an extended period of modest economic growth and sluggish housing demand, construction of new housing and preservation of existing communities will increasingly become a zero-sum game. I think for a while, there was a period, and again, this is part of going on a housing binge. You start getting delusional. We thought we could have it all. We thought we could have unlimited sprawl and unlimited urban revitalization, that we could have renewed vigor in northeastern and midwestern cities and continued explosive growth in the Sun Belt, all at the same time. It was an illusion. And now, I think we've got to start making choices. We can't have it all. One, we should encourage homeownership. I think there are benefits to homeownership, and I think we should encourage it. However, what we should not be doing is using public policy as we do to push up housing prices and encourage maximizing debt as part of our efforts to encourage homeownership. And here, you probably haven't heard this, you've probably heard this a few times before, and I realize this is quixotic, but I'm going to say it anyway. Can we finally take a look at doing away with the home mortgage interest tax deduction? It is a bad thing. Number one, and one thing that's interesting about the home mortgage, there's lots of research on this. This is one area. We know it does not encourage homeownership. Don't believe what the National Association of Realtors said. There's not a smidgen of evidence that the mortgage interest deduction encourages more people to become homeowners. What it does do is it pushes the price of housing up, which means that it is extremely regressive because it pushes the price of all housing up, but which means for lower income homeowners who typically do not itemize and do not get the deduction, they are paying the price for more affluent homeowners to get the deduction. Second, it encourages people to maximize debt rather than equity, and to borrow the most they can and to minimize the down payments, which has other negative effects on sustainability of homeownership. Third, it costs the Treasury over $100 billion a year. Now, I realize in an era when we're talking about deficits in the trillions, $100 billion might not seem like real money anymore. But it is. It's very significant. If you do it for 10 years, that's $1 trillion. That's real money. So I think it would be painful. I mean, certainly it would have to be phased out. It couldn't simply be ended overnight. But I would really make a strong plea that we take a fresh look at the home mortgage interest tax deduction. It is like a millstone around the necks of sound housing policy. Rental housing, it's very interesting. I remember in 2007, there were people, quite a few people, who predicted that as the foreclosure crisis grew, that this would create tremendous pressure on the rental housing stock, and we would see declining rental vacancy rates and increasing rent levels. Actually, we've seen the opposite. We've seen increased rental vacancy rates, and in many markets, including the Valley, rents have actually come down in both real and current dollars over the last couple of years. Rents have never been cheaper in many metropolitan areas. One byproduct, one reason for this is the exponential increase, and I'd say mainly since the beginning of 2009, in investment money coming into the market, buying distressed properties and turning them into rental housing. This is massive and has had a dramatic effect on the rental industry, including triggering enormous vacancy rates and dropping rents in garden apartment complexes in particular. The problem we now have is we have a highly unregulated rental industry existing under the public radar. While many are responsible owners, many others are destabilizing neighborhoods across the country and have seriously destabilized the multifamily rental industry in large parts of the country. Now, one thing that's important, I believe very strongly, and some people, I think, are under the impression that rental housing in the United States is mainly apartment buildings or projects. Actually, rental housing is mainly small properties, single-family houses, 2 to 4 unit properties, which are almost entirely owned not by corporations, not by real estate investment trusts, but by mom and pop owners, people like you or me. In fact, how many people in this room either own or have owned at some point a rental house or a rental property? You are the rental industry in the United States. Again, not the corporations, not the housing authorities, not the REITs. You. And I think what we need, when we think about rental housing from a policy matter, we need more policies to encourage responsible rental ownership by mom and pops, to make sure that they have access to decent financing, make sure that they have access to funds to maintain and improve their properties, and also make sure that we have the kind of effective code enforcement programs in our cities that ensure that they act responsibly. I might mention in passing, in France, virtually the entire private market rental stock is created through the government offering tax incentives to mom and pop people, small businesses and individuals and couples, to buy houses and apartments and maintain them as rental housing. And it has been very effective, and it has, what's fascinating is it has demonstrated that a country can have a healthy rental sector without a rental construction sector. And I think we should think about that. On the other hand, in areas like the coastal markets, where rental units can be in short supply and expensive, we may need to use these same incentives to encourage production. But again, for most of the country, it's not that we need more housing. We need to shepherd what we have better, which is the central point here. We should redirect our policies towards focusing on better utilization of existing housing. One thing, housing is extraordinarily durable if it's even moderately well maintained. Over half of all the houses that were in the United States in 1950 are still standing. Rehab is more labor intensive than new construction. And from an energy conservation standpoint, existing buildings contain substantial amounts of embedded energy. So a strategy that focuses on preserving and maximizing investment in existing housing through regulations and tax policy will not only help preserve communities, but will free up investment and energy resources to be used more productively. And better utilization of the existing housing also means better utilization of existing neighborhoods and communities. historically, in recent decades, we give lip service to stabilizing or preserving neighborhoods. We talk about it a lot, we believe in it, but the weight of public policy has basically encouraged people to move with their feet, vote with their feet, to move to the Sun Belt, to move from urban areas to the fringe. If we preserve existing communities, foster more compact settlement patterns, yes, even in the valley, that will ultimately create healthier, more energy efficient, and more economically stable communities. In that light, we should redesign our rules that favor greenfield or desert development over infill, provide incentives for individual investment in housing rehab, particularly in areas where the cost of acquisition and rehab exceeds the resulting market value of the house. So again, stabilizing neighborhoods and preserving the existing housing, I think, is the way to go in an environment of low prices, low production, and low demand. And I believe that if we did these things, coupled with the reforms to Fannie and Freddie and to the mortgage system that would ensure a steady flow of mortgage capital for both owner-occupied and rental housing, we will go a long way to stabilizing the housing market generally, helping to stabilize neighborhoods and build more sustainable communities. Finally, I'd like to touch on affordable housing, because this is a whole critical subset of public policy where personally I think we are seriously off base in our policies and our strategies. The main thing is for the next 10 years, the market will meet the needs of most families for which most affordable housing programs are designed in most parts of the United States. What that means, and these are the groups as they're defined by the federal government, who represent, if you will, the targets for affordable housing programs in the Las Vegas metropolitan area. The first thing is, except in unusual circumstances, we should stop favoring production of new affordable housing. In 9 out of 10 housing markets around the United States, there is more existing housing in fair or good condition that's already available on the market at costs that are significantly less than the cost to build a new home or apartment. It makes no sense to build additional housing where we can meet housing needs by using existing housing or spending modest amounts to upgrade that housing. The main affordable housing program in the United States today is a thing called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. The federal government spends roughly $5 billion a year to subsidize investment in low-income rental housing. Under the program guidelines, in the Valley, a new 2-bedroom apartment would rent for $800 to $1,000 a month. There are plenty of 2-bedroom apartments in the Valley that are renting for less than that. For the foreseeable future, Las Vegas does not need more housing in that price range. Building more housing in that price range will have the effect of further increasing vacancies and potentially leading to abandonment in the existing housing stock. One exception might be areas such as many northeastern metros, where you have exclusionary zoning, dramatic mismatches between where affordable housing is and where the jobs are, and continued racial segregation. New construction may be appropriate in those locations, but not elsewhere. Secondly, I think we should stop trying to foster more homeowners and focus on making sure that people who become homeowners on their own can become sustainable homeowners. The vast majority of low-income families who become homeowners do so with no public help, no down payment assistance, no closing cost assistance, no subsidies. In the last decade, roughly 1 million low-income families became homeowners each year. In the Valley, and this I thought was amazing, 2 out of every home purchase mortgages last year went to a family earning 80% of the area median income or less, for an average of $120,000. People can become home. If people have the desire and the ability, they will become homeowners. They do not need government help to get there. However, people, especially lower income people, who by definition have less money, have a much harder time staying homeowners once they become homeowners than more affluent people. Because they have less money, they are more likely to buy houses that either need repairs or are going to get into trouble down the road because they're buying the less expensive housing in the market. Because they have less money, they are more likely to be affected by other economic shocks, like a medical bill, the need to buy a new car, repair costs. So what we need, instead of programs to help people become homeowners, we need programs to help people stay homeowners, to make sure that they buy housing and move into a homeownership that is sustainable and long-term. Because one thing about the research on homeownership is that it's not just about being a homeowner. It's not just about having that mortgage and having that name on the title. It's about the stability and the sustainability that comes with it. The fact you're living in one place that is yours and that you stay in and that your children are going to the same school all the way through, and a lot of other factors. So that is the value of homeownership, and if we focus on that, we can add a great deal more value. We can make far more difference to people in need than we are currently doing when we create what has become, unfortunately, a homeownership revolving door for millions of households. We need to focus more on preserving, again, what we have in the way of affordable housing. Yesterday, the New York Times ran a story that talked about the fact that literally hundreds of thousands of public housing apartments and houses are falling apart in this country because the housing authorities that are responsible for them don't have the money to repair them and maintain them properly. If we took, for example, that $5 billion that's being used for low-income tax credits today and used that money to just rebuild, repair, restore public housing and other affordable housing, including privately owned affordable housing, we would make far more of a difference to people who really need it. And then finally, what about the people at the very bottom of the ladder, the poor, whose needs aren't being met either by the private market or by low-income housing programs, which typically go to the people earning 50 to 80% of median rather than the people below? Most of the housing, federal housing money goes to that population. $30 billion a year is spent in this country on housing vouchers to help people make up the difference between what they can afford and what it costs to live in housing. And yet, we are only helping at most, with all of our programs, all of our resources, we are at most helping 1 out of 4, and that's by HUD's own estimate, which is likely to be optimistic, of the households who are eligible for those programs. In the Las Vegas area, 92% of renter households earning less than $20,000 a year, which is the very low group, and that's 55,000 households are spending 35% or more, most cases 50% or more of their income for shelter. These are people who are not going to be helped by the market. Even as housing becomes less expensive and becomes within the reach of the low income and some even of the very low income population, it's not going to help the people near the bottom. These people, it's not that they aren't spending, not only that they're spending a lot for housing, they don't have enough left over to meet other needs, and that their living conditions are chronically unstable. Their children move from school to school, they move from neighborhood to neighborhood. It's a problem. So this, I think, ultimately, when it comes to looking at affordable housing, this is far and away the most serious problem that we're facing in this country, is the needs of the poor, not the moderately low income, not the moderate income and so forth, but the needs of the poorest families, the ones who are earning too little to benefit from the housing reset and to enable that they have decent housing where they can raise their families. I would like to think, and this is, again, quixotic, that someday the United States could afford a universal housing allowance, something like food stamps for families who are too poor to be able to live within the private market. Quite a few European countries already do so. Given conditions in this country for a foreseeable future, that's unlikely. Alternatively, one question is, should we spread around the money that we're already spending so that while no family would get quite as much as they are currently getting in assistance, more families would at least get some help in meeting their housing costs? I don't know the answer, but I think it's important to ask that question. So, at a time when millions of middle-class families are struggling and uncertain whether they will find a job or keep the one they have, it's hard to get people to think about the needs of those who are even less fortunate, whose struggles are even more difficult. But in closing, I'd like to suggest that both in the interest of our nation's future and our common humanity, we do remember that population as well. Thank you. Yes. Could we perhaps turn off the... yes. Okay, great. Okay, sir, and then...
I believe Canada does not subsidize or allow the homeowner to deduct the interest. If that's correct, I'm curious if you would know about how many homes in Canada are cash buyers. Cash buyers, no financing.
No, I don't know what percentage are cash buyers. Actually, the best research on the shift from the size of the down payment, the mortgage, was done some years ago. Finland actually changed their mortgage deduction from one that was similar to the United States in the sense of being essentially unlimited and open to anybody, to one that was very strictly capped and very limited. And they tracked, the researchers actually tracked home buying practices and the down payment rates and found that in the years following the change in the deduction, the percentage of down payments rose consistently and steadily. I should mention Canada has a higher home ownership rate than the United States. And also, for the record, this is something that you may not believe, of the 25 countries in the EU, 14 have higher home ownership rates than the United States. Did you have a question? Yeah. Oh, sorry, sir.
You mentioned that the average housing prices was going to kind of bump along with inflation, 1 or 2% above. Mm-hmm. Can you speculate on how the higher end housing, medium housing, and lower housing will do in relation to that? Will they all bump along together, or one group higher or lower? Or, you know?
It's really hard to say, because one thing I keep coming back to is this is a big country, and there's no one housing market in the United States. There are a lot of different markets. I think in most markets, I think we're going to see actually less appreciation at the high end than at the lower end. When I say lower end, I don't mean the very lower end, but generally sort of low to middle prices, particularly, pardon?
Starter homes.
Yeah, starter homes, modest homes, because again, for two reasons. One is because the largest concentration of household growth are going to be on the part of people who are not going to be looking for, these aren't people in their settled families in their late 30s and 40s and so forth. These are either young people, single people, elderly people, new immigrants and stuff. They're not going to be looking, for the most part, for high-priced stuff. And then, again, that'll be compounded by the weak consumer confidence which is going to tend to make people be reluctant to push themselves in terms of buying the most expensive housing they could buy, but rather settling for less because it's more affordable and because it's more about shelter than investment. Sorry. David?
You mentioned before about eliminating possibly the home mortgage tax deduction because, or as an effect, it also maximizes debt.
Mm-hmm.
What's your gut feel on what the appropriate amount of equity would be for a homeowner?
Well, I think it varies. I mean, I think, okay, the first part is, the short answer is at least some. I think, again, there's lots of evidence that people who make no down payment, all controlling for any other social or economic or demographic factor you can think of, have significantly higher rates of default than their counterparts who have made at least some down payment. I think the basic concept, in fact, that banks are sort of leaning towards is that you calibrate down payment, the size of the down payment, against risk factors. I think makes sense. I think if you have somebody who is a very low risk person with excellent credit history, et cetera, and substantial other assets and so forth, then a relatively small down payment may be appropriate. The greater the risk, I would think it is more appropriate to have larger down payments. I think, on the other hand, one issue that we still need more work on is to figure out how to do that in a way that does not unreasonably penalize prospective lower income home buyers who might be able to come up with a 5 or 7% down payment without too much difficulty, but for whom 20% simply places home ownership out of reach.
And does that also follow that you'd have a higher down payment, but also not a higher interest rate for those that were at greater risk?
I think a higher interest rate, this is, I think, one of the fallacies of the whole credit scoring / subprime era was the notion that you could mitigate the risks associated with lower credit scores by simply increasing the cost of the mortgage to the home buyer, which actually had an interactive effect because what you were doing, you were adding a factor to the equation that was increasing risk at the same time as you thought you were mitigating the risk. So I think adjusting interest rates to mitigate risk is a pretty questionable proposition. I think it's basically not a good practice, that you should basically have interest rates that are as low as reasonably possible. The other thing you do not want to do is if somebody comes in, you're a mortgage broker. Are there any in this room?
We're not telling.
And somebody comes in and says, I want to buy this house, and I can afford it and only pay 20% of my income for principal, interest, and taxes. And as a mortgage broker, you shouldn't say, oh, come on, you can afford a lot more than that. We want to make sure that people's housing is as affordable as it can be. And this is true whether your income is low, moderate, or high. The society and the economy does not benefit from overconsumption of housing as a good. I think there was a here and then back here. Sir.
Yes. I'm bothered by all of our tax dollars that do go to people who have subsidized housing, going to a lot of lawyers and doctors and other investors who buy 3, 4, 5 rentals, and all that tax dollar goes to them as income. I'm wondering what would be the effect if you made some kind of a law that no person could own more than 2 or 3 houses. What would it do to our political system? Make it communist?
Well, I don't know that would be very good policy, because if somebody can buy and properly maintain housing, I mean, it's just like any business. If you want to own housing, It's one thing if you want to own gas stations or nail salons or something. So I would be reluctant to restrict it. I think the most important thing we can do in that area is, if we are going to provide government subsidies through housing vouchers, to have a strong regulatory system that makes sure that the people who own rental housing and benefit from those vouchers are maintaining the housing in high quality, properly screen and monitor their tenants, do all of the things that a responsible landlord should do, and hold them to that quite strictly. And I think if we do that, they will have earned the subsidies.
Why don't we give that title to the people? I remember the beautiful buildings they built in Chicago, and then years later they blew them all up. Why not give that title to those people and say, hey, if the gangs are here, it's up to you to guard it with your life if you have to. It's your property. If there's a hole in it, you fix it. Wouldn't that be a better idea than trying to regulate people who own those houses to properly fix things?
I think the problem is, or one big problem is, that many people, if you gave them the title to a piece of property, they wouldn't really know what to do with it. And I think, it's not easy being
against the poor?
Pardon?
Are you thinking the poor are so ignorant they don't know how
No,
to
but I am thinking that in this country we have typically about a third of the population are tenants, about 2/3 are not. And that is probably a pretty reasonable percentage. It's not far from the percentage in a lot of other countries which have similar economies and demographics to us. And I think an awful lot of people, not just poor people, make better tenants than they make homeowners. And I think that's a reality. And I think pushing people into homeownership who don't actively, personally want to be homeowners is not a good idea, whether the people are poor or rich or middle class. Sir?
It seems to me that this whole bubble, as I've looked at it, is it seems like we lost our moral compass. There are a lot of people that could have blown the whistle along the way that chose not to because they were making a lot of money. And in fact, Jim Johnson, the chair of Brookings, spoke last week, and he made two comments that resonated with me. Fannie Mae was a success, now in receivership. The other was that the way we compensate investment bankers is the American way. And I'm going to paraphrase for the students in the audience today. When you were talking about lack of leadership, what that really means is you guys are screwed, because there is no leadership right now. And if you don't step up and take some leadership, the public unions are taking money, the baby boomers are going to take money, they're going to take every bit of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid they can. And if we don't get some leadership in this country, like you say, there's no answer.
Again, I hate to predict, and I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, like a Dr. Doom, and I certainly don't want to get involved in anything resembling partisan politics this close to an election. But I think there's a lot to that. I think certainly an awful lot of this country lost its moral compass. I agree with you on that. I think, again, when you go on a binge, you lose track. And this is whether it's true of an individual or true of an entire society. You lose track of what is right behavior. And I think an awful lot of our institutions and our individuals and our private and our public sector lost track of that. And I think we've been forced back to a recognition of what went wrong. But what is scary is, are we capable of doing what's right? And so, I mean, it's easy for me to look at this. I'm 66 years old. I live in a house that's paid for. It's not going to be my problem. But I think it's critical that we, instead of sort of taking refuge in empty slogans, we call on our political leadership, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Socialists, Libertarians, whatever they are, to say, look, You guys have got to work together to help us get this country back on an even keel. Because I think if we don't do that, I think there's a real risk we're not going to get there. Sir?
I want to thank you very much for giving an honest evaluation of our situation for our nation. And yeah, so thank you.
You're welcome. I wish it were otherwise. Sir?
Yeah, we have a kind of a unique thing here in Vegas. If the old adage is follow the money, you go down to 4th Street and watch the auctions and the foreclosures. They're done at the Nevada Legal Services. Now this is a non-judicial state. And the houses, when you go down there, every day of the week, 5 days a week, they auction off 300 to 400. And the money that's being bid by the investors, their representatives, their agents are sitting there, will be in the $30,000 to $80,000 range starting bids. They may run them up $20,000, $30,000. Now, those are homes that the investor is going to rent, going back to your idea of affordable rentals. The upper end houses are going back to the bank. And those are the ones in foreclosures that will show up in your neighborhood. I don't think most people in this part of the country understand just how many houses go through that auction down there on 4th Street on a given day. Now, those are only houses being auctioned off in foreclosure by the banks. They're not the ones you see at the Marriott Hotel that are auctioned off for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It's a staggering amount of inventory that we've got to work with. It's huge.
It is huge.
If I could comment on that, I went last week, there were 937 houses auctioned off on one day. 925 of them were bought by the banks. 12 were sold to people who wanted to bid what they asked for.
Yeah. But what is happening, and again, it's hard to get exact numbers, but clearly an awful lot of the houses that, whether they're bought, typically the investors typically, some of them buy at the auctions, but most of them do not actually bid against the banks at the auctions. They let the banks take them back and then they're sold. But certainly a huge percentage of the houses that are being foreclosed, and the numbers are staggering, in the Valley, in Phoenix, in Florida, in all of these areas, are being bought by investors and are being re-rented. Now, in some cases, these are very responsible people and the properties are well maintained. In other cases, they are not. In many cases, though, when you think about it, given how weak home buyer demand is, what worries me sometimes is these investors are not necessarily taking housing that would otherwise be bought by homeowners. In many cases, these investors are taking housing that if they did not take it, might well end up becoming abandoned and ultimately stripped.
What about the houses the banks just leave there?
Well,
don't put on the market, they park cars in front of them to make strangers think that someone lives there. How many years are they going to hang on to those till they're so underwater they go for?
Yeah. Well, the banks ultimately are at least semi-rational actors. I mean, the problem the banks are looking at, and again, this is such a mess, it has so many different dimensions to it. The banks are clearly concerned that if they put too much stuff on the market too fast, they'll push the prices even further down than they already are. And so to some extent, they may be trying to ration the supply and would hopefully try to track the market and put the houses on the market as they see it stabilizing in relative terms. They may also be trying to in many cases, banks are also talking to large investors, and this has its own problems as well. Banks are negotiating with large investors in many cases, including some hedge funds, to buy properties in bulk at even deeper discounts, but just to unload their properties. So there's a lot going on kind of under the surface. I'm not saying it's good, but there's a lot going on. with these properties. They're not going to sit there forever, I hope. Sir?
Are banks likely to do more short refinancing as opposed to just putting more and more stuff in the foreclosure pipeline and spending it up and down?
Okay. 6 months ago, I probably would have said yes, because what I've been looking at is certainly, if you look at the national statistics, the numbers of short sales have been going up. But it seems to be a very uneven kind of process. Banks seem to be very ambivalent about short sales. And banks, so for example, again, there's been stuff in, I know the New York Times, I think just yesterday, that I think they were focusing on GMAC in particular, in this case, which seems to be pulling back from doing short sales. I personally think that in most cases, a short sale is better for the bank, as well as certainly better for the homeowner, and better for the community, the neighborhood, the subdivision, than a foreclosure. But yeah, no, but I think for whatever reasons, I think banks are still have very mixed feelings. I think one problem, and I'll just mention this, and then is that I think banks, like any other large institution, tightly structured, hierarchical, bureaucratic institution, tends to operate on the basis of routine and what we've always done, and the actions that can be taken without anybody criticizing them. Sort of the default setting. The default setting for banks, whether servicers and the like, is to foreclose. No secure owner of one of the securities, which these mortgages are in, can fault a servicer for foreclosing. None of them can come and say you shouldn't have foreclosed. But if a servicer, the entity that's actually doing the foreclosure, takes any action other than foreclosing, they are potentially at risk of being second-guessed by their clients, basically, who are the holders of the securities. So it's easier, it is just much easier for people to foreclose than to do any of the different things that would make it better for the homeowner, for the community, and ultimately for their own balance sheet.
Alan, I think one more question, and then Alan will also be around afterwards.
Let's see, is there somebody, have you asked a question before, I think? Let me turn then to the woman across the aisle.
You touched on earlier how
You'll have to speak up.
how people to change their outlook as their home is no longer an investment but actually shelter. Maybe expand a little on that, of how you see that changing in our country, kind of the rich dad, poor dad idea of everyone can own a house and be real estate investors. Well, it's no longer that idea, it's more back to it is a shelter. And rather than staying in a home for shorter terms, say 5 to 7 years and buying up, do people start staying in their homes longer?
Well, the answer is maybe. Okay, I mean, what you had during the binge was a massive shift in people started to look, as people have said, they started to look at their home as their ATM. And that was clearly a bad thing. And also one thing it did do, which is also very bad for the economy, because it's basically not healthy when the price of houses reaches levels that are not supportable by the distribution of household incomes or by the level of rent in the system. Now, one thing I remember, this is a bit of a roundabout way, what I think of as my aha moment during the binge came fairly late. I was in Los Angeles, and I was meeting with some housing people, and they were talking, and somebody pointed out that just that past month, the median house price in LA had just gone over $500,000. And I said, wait a minute, I just looked at the statistic for the median family income in the LA area, and it's $50,000. You can't have a housing market where the median price is 10 times the median family income. It simply does not work. So I think that's what happens when you start to think of housing as purely as an investment, especially as a speculative investment. Now, housing, interestingly, historically, housing in most markets over most periods has been a fairly good investment. It has not been a get-rich-quick scheme in most cases, but it has been a decent investment. And I suspect if you bought a house, we don't know yet, and this is one of the questions, when things are going to bottom out. But if you bought a house in the next year or so in Las Vegas, and let's say you put 10% down, and that house then appreciated 1 or 2% above the rate of inflation. At the end of 10 years, you're not going to be rich, but your investment, because after all, you're leveraging your down payment, your investment would have appreciated at a rate which is probably going to be a fair amount better than if you put it in a 4 or 5 year CD. So it's not, housing should appreciate modestly and provide an opportunity for a modest return on the amount that you put in to the house in equity. But ultimately, the main value of housing, after all, is and should be that it's a place where you live. It's a place where you don't have to pay rent, but you're actually building equity and living in your own home. It's a place where you have stability of tenure, a place where you can engage, hopefully, with the community that you're part of and have those other values. And I think whether it's likely to lead to people staying more for longer periods, that's hard to say, because that also intersects with what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to different job trends around the country. People are mobile for a lot of reasons besides what's happening with their house values. But I think it might well increase people's likelihood to stay in the same place. And if that's so, and this is perhaps because I'm relatively old and relatively conservative in my social values, I wouldn't consider that a bad thing.
We're going to have to invite you back for phase 2 of this talk in a few months. Thank you all for coming and for your great questions, and I hope we see you on the 10th.
Thank you, Alan. We enjoyed it again.